Speaking of terrible economic policies and the budget, you actually wrote this back in January. We were discussing this on WhatsApp at the time. This is the reason I've titled this show "Is Britain Going to Collapse?" is because you have, I hope you don't mind me saying this, privately been trying to convince me that the country is basically in a total economic doom loop that our incompetent leaders, pictured here, will not get us out of. And you wrote in here, if I might do a quote before you elaborate, the yield on British 30-year government bonds, which are gilts, has risen to their highest level since 1998 at 5.22%. The current yield on a 30-year government bond is now higher than when the markets experienced a convulsion after the failed tax cuts of the Liz Truss government in 2022. And the problem is that the British government is still borrowing heavily with a budget deficit of 4.4 GDP. Now, care to explain to we, the sort of less economically literate, why Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are not currently out on their arse having resigned, but Liz Truss had to when there was less of a problem in the market than there was now?
I personally think that Liz Truss is not a conspiracy theorist and that she was run out of town by the establishment. I really do think that. I don't think it was a tinfoil hat conspiracy. I think what happened was that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng put together a tax breaks package. Now, for the record, I didn't think it was a particularly good tax breaks package. I didn't think it would get economic growth going, etc. Okay, so I'm not like a partisan for Liz Truss's tax break package, but it was a pretty modest tax break package. It wasn't some absolutely lunatic, crazy thing at all. It was a pretty modest Thatcherite tax policy, right? And they floated it, and it was hated by the Troika, right? By the OBR, the Treasury, and the Bank of England, who are mostly centre-left Keynesian economists running it. And they didn't like it. They just thought it was silly, and they didn't think it would work. And again, for the record, I didn't think it would particularly work either. But it's not up to them. Okay, Liz Truss wasn't elected, but her party was elected, and the party chooses the prime minister. That's how the system works in Britain. And basically, what happened was the press went into action. It was a kind of an organic formation. The civil servant class went out and started bitching to the press. Frankly, they started saying, "This is a terrible package. This is so stupid." And then as kind of like Truss hate built in the Whitehall gang, they started becoming more and more shrill. I remember it at the time. Oh, this will destroy the country and stuff. And at that point, when I was looking at it, I said, this isn't going to destroy the country, guys. This may or may not be a good or a bad tax package, but this isn't some existential issue for Britain. And they talked the press into a hysteria. And then what happened was the markets follow the press. So they saw all this stink in the British press and they started selling off bonds. And look, I don't know for a fact, but I think the Bank of England refused to intervene. Or at least they didn't intervene in the way that they usually would. And if the Bank of England isn't there to calm markets, markets will spiral out of control. And that's what happened. And I think afterwards they realized the power that they had. And what actually terrifies me is they now see that as a tool of control for governments. That's scary. And I can talk about that some more because there's some evidence in Europe that they've cottoned onto that too. And there's some rumors that they might try it in America, although that looks less and less likely by the day because it's been quite well managed there. But that's effectively what happened. So now Labour are facing. Now, I will say it's not. If Britain was a completely fiscally healthy country, the operation wouldn't have run that way. You know what I mean? The country had to be kind of broke first in order to have this happen. But what's happening now is the situation's got much worse under Labour. And why aren't we seeing the level of crisis? Well, we are seeing some. If you go back 2 weeks ago, or you're talking about that article there, or even a few weeks ago, there was a lot of action in sterling market. We are seeing this action around the edges, but the institutions are containing it, which is their job, by the way. That's what the taxpayer pays them for. They are containing it and they're trying to give Labour as much runway as possible. But ultimately, the issue is that the country is pretty much broke. It's a consensus thing. This isn't some kind of like gold book thing that you'll find on Zero Hedge. Like everyone knows this, everyone thinks this. The Troika in Britain think this. The Bank of England thinks it. The OBR thinks it. The government thinks it. Rachel Reeves thinks it. So but that's effectively what happened with Liz Truss, and I just think it's really disgraceful because that's not the way the government's supposed to work in Britain. That's not the way the government's supposed to work anyway. And by the way, what did they succeed in doing? Ousting Truss, the budget situation got worse. I mean, the Truss crowd can still credibly say, well, the tax cut could have worked. Again, I don't think it would have, But like they can still credibly say that. The alternative clearly didn't work. So the whole thing's completely bizarre.
If they would have conjoined it with the later spending cut announcement that was planned, I think that, well, obviously they would have been met with terminal resistance by, as Liz would say, the deep state, but it might have done a way to balance the books better than Sunak did. I think she would kill you were she here to say that she was unelected. She'd say, buy members, buy members. So she would say that she's still more legitimate than Rishi. Though what did perk up my ears there is when you said that the Federal Reserve, central banks, etc., could be weaponized against governments and depose them in the Truss mold. I know that J.D. Vance mentioned this in his pre-election interview with Tucker Carlson, that he said, I like Liz Truss, I don't agree with everything she's done economically, but we're looking at her as kind of a cautionary tale for how central banks could depose an elected government. I wrote a long essay explaining all the mechanisms for how the Bank of England mismanaged the liability-driven investments, that the pension products that we use in this country, again, pensions, factoring into the inability to control our budget, and how they bet against them, and then they were responsible for 2/3 of the run on the bond market, and then they sort of blamed it on the mini budget, even though they didn't control interest rates that were cut slightly a few days before, and how she was scapegoated for this.
Yeah,
It
there
was
was a
handed.
reputation laundering element to the trust thing. There was a
Mm,
reputation, there was a bunch of gunk piled up in the system, and they flushed it all out and blamed it on Liz Truss. That is true.
yeah, and I handed that piece to the Trump camp, so I hope that, along with you, they're more wise to this. But what's happening in Europe? I'm not aware of this. What's that?
So this was a few months ago when it looked like Marine Le Pen might get elected in France. And this will obviously happen again when Marine Le Pen eventually gets elected in France. There was all these stories in the newspaper again about bond market attacks on the French government, the French bond market. We had a whole 2 weeks or a week of this press coverage. I think the French equivalent of the Chancellor, Finance Minister, I suppose, came out and made a statement or something. I can't remember all the details, but there was basically a week or two where the financial press went into the same mode. Basically, if Le Pen gets elected, everything's going to melt down. Again, France is pretty much broke as well. It's not like it's completely made up. But they switched immediately to that. And then the moment when it seemed like the On March Macron's party had got the situation under control with some very aggressive arm twisting and electioneering, there was no talk of it anymore. None. I mean, they went back to kind of like, we need pension reform, we need this, we need that. The country is kind of broke, so it went back to normal, but there was no talk about crisis or anything like that. Oh, and one more detail on that. The focal point was that, as people may know, Marine Le Pen is a kind of a left on economics, right on social policy candidate. So I think there is reason to think that she may have boosted spending or something. But the alternative that was electioneered was like half like communist socialist who wanted like really far left policies, and yet when they got in and it looked like Le Pen was put to the side, no mention of that, none. Now French borrowing yields never recovered from that. France is paying higher interest rates because of that little operation. But that speaks to an even broader thing about this and why I think it's so noxious. They don't care. They don't seem to care, the people that are doing this. They care far more about controlling the politics than they do about managing interest rates. The jobs of these institutions, first and foremost, is to try and have financial stability and maintain as low borrowing costs as the market allows. They can't work magic, but they have to try and keep them as low as possible. But in these instances where one of these operations is run, borrowing costs go up, taxpayers pay more, the debt situation gets worse, but no one holds them to account for it. It's really, really, really corrupt, I think.
That's quite interesting because I wonder if the Le Pen model might wise up to this, because Trump is occupying a similar space in politics. His national populist approach has captured a lot of ground from economic populists. A lot of the former Bernie bros moved over to Trump because he said, I'm not going to touch entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, but I'm also going to try and balance the budget. And people were scratching their heads as to how he might do that. And then Elon Musk emerged on the horizon with the Department of Government Efficiency and has cut things like USAID and is shaping down entire government departments like the Department for Education, which has delivered absolutely no positive results since it was set up in the 70s. And so people are wondering if you might be able to do this economic populism, national preference policy. You have socialized medicine and pensions, while also jettisoning all of the what Charlotte Gill would call woke waste in the civil service, in the deep state. This is something that Liz now knows that she couldn't really have done in the time because of all of the committed spending through things like the Equality Act and the Constitutional Reform Act on that very woke deep state. But if you were to get in, like Musk, take Malay's golden chainsaw to all this sort of stuff, if Le Pen were to do that, would France still be in the same debt problem? If the UK were to have someone to do that in 29, would we still be in the same debt problem? If we could cut all of our woke committed spending but try to preserve things like socialised medical and pensions, is that possible?
I mean, I want to give Musk and them the benefit of the doubt, but I think what they're going to ultimately find out is that the low-hanging fruit, like USAID and the Department of Education, I'm not saying these things are easy to reform. Like I hate USAID. Like hats off. I've been tweeting about it for 2 weeks.
Especially
Hats
as an
off for 'em.
Irishman.
It's just about every way. It's just about every way possible. The USA thing, I mean, that's a whole different story, but it's repulsive actually, and it's colonial and it's nasty and it's weird. But so hats off. And those are difficult things to get done, but they're not huge cost savers. In the long run, the two big things in the US, I mean, basically are entitlements, which as you've said, they don't want to touch. And by the way, borderline impossible, even in France, to get the pension age down really hard. I think the one place where they might be able to eke out some spending will be the Pentagon, military spending. But man, that's going to be a fight, and all the chicken hawks will be out telling you that you're unpatriotic and stuff like that. And frankly, I don't think any cuts will. I'd hate to be so pessimistic, but I don't think any cuts would conceivably save Britain that won't massively impact people's lives. But the lowest hanging fruit is the military budget, like it's Trident and stuff like that. And I don't think people are willing to go for that. And even if they did, it would be 50 billion maybe or something like that if you really knocked it down and you went after a couple of other departments. But the reality is it's mostly in the UK, it's mostly NHS and that kind of thing. And you can say, oh, well, we'll bring in efficiency gains and stuff like that. It's really hard. It's really hard. I personally think that by the end of the unwinding in the British fiscal situation, that healthcare will end up partly privatized. I think it's pretty much inevitable. I'm not advocating for it. I'm not advocating against it per se, but I think it might end up being the reality.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m., only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.